Good morning. Feels a little overwhelming to me today. Maybe it will to you too. But today I'm going to give you kind of an overview of really 6 historical books in the Old Testament. I'm going to talk to you about the time of the United Kingdom. So as we delve into the lives of Saul and David and Solomon, we can have an understanding of what we should be looking for, the great themes, and the intimate stories that we'll be reading about. So let me start by saying 1st and 2nd Samuel. Samuel, as you will recall, was kind of the hinge point between the time of the judges and the time of the kings. He was the last prophet. He was the one who anointed the first king. He was the one who lived in a time when everyone did as they pleased, and when they rebelled against God again and again, and God had to send forth judges to rescue them. He was also there at the very beginning of the United Monarchy, when 3 kings came and one at a time began consolidating and ruling all of Israel, with some notable exceptions. As the last of the judges, Samuel had a difficult task. He was a prophet of the Lord, guiding the people, speaking for the Lord, and doing, frankly, a much better job than his immediate predecessors. However, the people he was guiding wanted something different. Samuel knew that the thing they wanted was not what God wanted for them. They desired a king like those nations around them had. They looked at the military and political might of one ruler and thought, well, surely it would be better to have a human ruler than to have to listen to someone speak for God, a prophet or a priest, and for God to rule us. Wouldn't it be nice to have a ruler with flesh on him? They wanted again to be like the other nations. Philistine aggression had pushed the Israelites so far. Their Philistines had superior weaponry, and they had a centralized government. They seemed to have a lot of things going for them. And the people of Israel came to Samuel and said, we want a king like that the Philistines have. Samuel said no. He went to the Lord. He said no. And finally, the Lord said, warn them. Tell them what it will be like. What will be the implications? And he said, if you take a king to be like your neighbors, you will also suffer like your neighbors. Your king will enslave your sons and your daughters. Your king will tax you heavily. And they said, we don't care. We want a king. Okay, said Samuel. They want a king. And God said, I'll give them a king. And this is the king he gave them. We read the story about how Saul became the first king of Israel. Saul is a man who couldn't even keep track of his father's donkeys. He's a man that hid behind the baggage when people wanted to acclaim him as ruler. He was a man with so many flaws that his mental illness and his outright disobedience to the Lord would result in he and his children losing the kingship forever. He was the first king of the United Monarchy. The United Monarchy. This is the reign, again, of Saul, David, and Solomon, the 3 kings. They were the only kings that held the whole of the nation of Israel, north and south, together at any one time. Only 3 of them ruled before the nation split into a terrible civil war. Many nations have had civil wars, and some have come back from it. But Israel, the Israelites, never did. North and South Israel, respectively known as Israel and Judah. They sometimes made alliances, but after the death of Saul, they split irrevocably. So this period of time, this united monarchy, was unique in the history of Israel and the history of God's people. Keep in mind that the monarchy was never totally united, never complete. We can see that in the stories of the rivalry between David, for example, and Saul, or David's sons and David. There are plenty of things that aren't united, and the tendency for the North and the South to blame each other for the problems would continue for 120 years. We can see that not all the promised land was under the control and rule of the Israelites either. For example, during the reign of Saul, there were pockets of areas where the Canaanites ruled very strongly, including Jerusalem itself and Mount Gilboa. We saw in Joshua and in Judges how the conquest was incomplete, and this would come back to haunt the Israelites. This would be an ongoing problem. One of the key things to be aware of when you're reading these stories is that 1st and 2nd Samuel is really just one book. They get their name from Samuel, an early character in the story. This is a common way of naming biblical books. Remember Genesis, in the beginning? That's what Genesis means, and those are the first words in the book of Genesis. This is what's called incipit naming. Incipit is a Latin word which means in the beginning of. Incipit naming. Excuse me. This is very common in biblical books and actually common for us today. Well, when you go to church and you sing a song called Blessed Assurance, Jesus is Mine, what's the song title? Blessed Assurance. When you sing Amazing Grace, How Sweet the Sound, what's the title? Amazing Grace. We use incipit naming quite a bit, even in our culture. We also might be struck by the fact that by the time we get to 2 Samuel, Samuel's not even in the story. He's dead and gone. So why is it still called 2 Samuel? Why isn't it named after some of the other characters in this book? Well, we also need to know that 1st and 2nd Samuel were originally one book, just as 1st and 2nd Kings and 1st and 2nd Chronicles were one book. They, however, were divided into sections as late as 3rd and 2nd century BC, when the Septuagint, a Greek translation of Hebrew, was written for the Jews who had fled to Egypt after the fall of Babylon. So it's a relatively new device to have 1st and 2nd Samuel. We also see, well, do you remember I talked to you a few weeks ago about what's called bifid literature? Extra credit if you remember that. It refers to a form of literature where you have two parts to one story. The book of Samuel is a classic type of bifid literature. The first half is about the reign of Saul, and the second half is about the reign of David. We have so many individual stories to look at in the next these six narratives: 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles. And we punctuate those with the Psalms in our Bible study readings, because we're seeing how the Psalms really captured the experiences, especially those David had when he was hiding in the wilderness and fleeing from Saul. I want to give you a little bit of orienting data, which will help you in the reading. First of all, I'll remind you that there's 3 levels in narrative, or 3 levels we should be looking for in every story. The first level is the big picture level, the top level of the narrative. This would be kind of like if you look at a puzzle, it's all been put together and you could see the whole picture. For the Bible, the whole picture is the story of God's redemption. His work throughout history to redeem us from sin. That's the first level of the narrative, the upper level. The second level are sections of that narrative, or sections of the puzzle. Oh, the house is over here, the trees are over here, the flower garden's here. We look at sections in the mid-level. Sections might include the story of all of Saul's life. So if you took just Saul's life and read only the passages about his life and you came to understand that, that's the second level. The third level of narrative, which we often read and we hear preached on in church, is the lowest of the levels. These are the individual passages or stories that tell us of an event that happened in the life of the people or life of Israel. For example, the one I referred to about Saul hiding among the baggage. What do we learn about him when we look at that story? And I want to encourage you to stop when you get to a lower level story and say, how does this fit into the other levels of the story? How does everything I read fit into my overall understanding of this time and these people and of God's redemption plan? If you do that as a discipline as you read, you'll be so much further along than most Bible scholars. So if you want to understand the richness of the Bible, I suggest you use this device, studying the narrative stories at each of their levels. Now, here's some of the things you should be noticing in your readings in the next couple of weeks. First of all, if you look at the first 7 chapters of 1 Samuel, Samuel is the star. He's the leading man. He's the focus of these chapters. Yes, Eli's there, and I spoke about Hannah last week, but 95% of what you're reading about is about Samuel. Then from 1 Samuel 8 to Samuel 15, you have Samuel and Saul working together. The stories tend to be about them both, interaction between the two of them. Then when you hit 1 Samuel 16 and onward, suddenly this shepherd boy named David arrives on the scene, and Samuel walks off the stage. Samuel is no further role to play. Only the mention of his death is given to us later on. And now we come to the bifid, the middle of the bifid point. After the division of the book, 1 and 2 Samuel, you then have just David alone. You move, therefore, from the last judge to the first great or the greatest of kings, David, in 1 and 2 Samuel. Pay attention to this movement. Also, you will see a lot about David, the rise and tumultuous fall of David. Many people have spoken of David as that man after God's own heart, meaning that he was perfect. As you read the story, you will find he was far from perfect. Yes, he was a great military leader, and that was his strength. He was a fabulous military leader, and he did unify Israel in a way that the others hadn't. He did a lot of things right, but he did so many wrong. And this is a lesson to us that God's choice does not necessarily equal God's approbation. He chooses to use people. He doesn't approve of everything they do. He chose to use David, an imperfect man. He appointed him king. He designated him. He didn't say, David, I've examined you. I found you righteous. You're just like Noah. You're even better than Noah. Therefore, I'm going to use you for my purposes. No. He gave David a prominent place in history, and accordingly, there'll be much made of him in Scripture. But there's so much detail about him that tells us he was not a moral example. He's an example of a great God, not necessarily a great man. Another important thing we will look at is the whole messianic Davidic covenant. We'll look at the covenant God made with David and his heirs, a covenant which affects us today. We also will look at the completion of the conquest. See how the promised land was ultimately subdued through David for at least a time. We'll also look at the choice of Jerusalem. Jerusalem eventually becomes the biblical city, the place where we all belong, the metaphor in Scripture for heaven itself. Look at Jerusalem and how God sets it apart. We also will see the horrible consequences of David's adultery and murder. You will see that David suffers the consequences, and indeed, his whole family will suffer the consequences. The sword will not depart from your family, the prophet said. It's a way of saying from now on, family warfare. And certainly the sins of families affect generations. Various rebellions against David will show that he was at times a very weak leader, even though a good soldier. In many ways, if he weren't as popular as he was and didn't have the allies he'd had, he would not have lasted as long as he did. And finally, we're going to look at the development of the temple. The temple is very important, and the transition from tabernacle to temple is a significant one, and we see that going on in these 3 books. There's a transition from judgeship to kingship, from tribe to nation, and from tabernacle to temple. We will see all that happening in these stories, and by the time we finish with the story of Solomon, we will see that we have the temple fully built and use, and there's no more tabernacle. So I think if you look at those themes and these readings with the whole sweep of what God's doing in mind, you might get more out of it. I think it'll be very exciting the next few weeks, and I look forward to coming with you to a deeper dive to different parts of what we're reading in the following weeks. God bless you.